In the early dawn of a crisp autumn morning in 1512, during the vibrant yet precarious opening years of King Henry VIII's reign, the city of London stirred to life under a veil of mist rising from the Thames. The young monarch, just 3 years into his rule, embodied the promise of a new era, athletic, learned, and ambitious, with a court that glittered like the jewels on his doublet. Yet for the ordinary folk who made up the bulk of the city's 50,000 souls, life unfolded in the rhythms of survival and routine, far removed from the opulent halls of Whitehall or Greenwich Palace. These were the merchants, artisans, boatmen, and housewives who navigated the narrow, winding streets of timber-framed houses, their days shaped by the ebb and flow of commerce, the toll of church bells, and the ever-present undercurrent of royal whims that could upend their world. In the early dawn of a crisp autumn morning in 1512, during the vibrant yet precarious opening years of King Henry VIII's reign, the city of London stirred to life under a veil of mist rising from the Thames. The young monarch, just 3 years into his rule, embodied the promise of a new era, athletic, learned, and ambitious, with a court that glittered like the jewels on his doublet. Yet for the ordinary folk who made up the bulk of the city's 50,000 souls, life unfolded in the rhythms of survival and routine, far removed from the opulent halls of Whitehall or Greenwich Palace. These were the merchants, artisans, boatmen, and housewives who navigated the narrow, winding streets of timber-framed houses, their days shaped by the ebb and flow of commerce, the toll of church bells, and the ever-present undercurrent of royal whims that could upend their world. Picture a modest home in Southwark, just south of the river, where the Thames served as both lifeline and barrier. The dwelling was typical of Tudor London, a 2-story structure of oak beams infilled with wattle and daub, its upper floor jutting out over the cobbled lane below to maximize space in the crowded urban sprawl. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke from the hearth and the faint mustiness of rush-strewn floors scattered with herbs like rosemary and lavender to ward off vermin and foul odors. In one such household lived Thomas Hale, a wool merchant's apprentice in his mid-20s, his wife Agnes, and their 2 young children. Thomas awoke as the first light filtered through the small leaded glass window, the shutters creaking open to reveal the gray silhouette of St. Saviour's Priory across the way. The priory's bells would soon peal for matins, summoning the faithful to prayer and marking the start of the day's labors. Agnes rose first, as was customary, to kindle the fire in the central hearth. She used a flint and steel to spark life into the embers banked overnight, adding dried peat and kindling until flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. Water from a bucket drawn the previous evening from a nearby conduit was heated in a cauldron for washing. Hygiene, though not as meticulous as in later centuries, was a priority for those who could afford it. The Tudors valued cleanliness, especially among the middling sort. Agnes wiped her face and hands with a linen cloth dipped in the warm water, scented lightly with rose water she had bartered for at the market. Thomas followed suit, combing his hair with a bone comb and donning his woolen hose, linen shirt, and doublet. Practical attire for a day of haggling over bales of cloth. Breakfast was simple but sustaining. A pottage of oats simmered with leeks and herbs from their small garden plot, accompanied by coarse rye bread and ale, the safer beverage in a city where river water often carried disease. The children, still sleepy, slurped their portions from wooden bowls. The family gathered around a trestle table that would be dismantled later to clear space. By the time the sun had burned off the mist, Thomas bid farewell to his family and stepped out into the lane. Southwark was a bustling suburb, known for its breweries, bear-baiting arenas, and less savory pursuits, but it was also a gateway to the heart of London. To reach the city proper, one crossed the Thames, either via the iconic London Bridge, a marvel of medieval engineering lined with shops and houses, or by one of the countless wherries, flat-bottomed boats ferried by watermen. Thomas opted for a boat this morning, the air crisp and the river traffic light. He hailed a waterman at the bankside stairs, a sturdy fellow in a weathered jerkin who rowed with practiced strokes against the sluggish current. The Thames was the city's artery, teeming with swans, barges laden with coal from Newcastle, and fishing skiffs. As they glided past, Thomas caught glimpses of the grander world, the spires of St. Paul's Cathedral piercing the skyline, and in the distance, the Tower of London, where the king occasionally held court amid its ancient battlements. Rumors swirled among the boatmen, whispers of Henry's preparations for war with France, the lavish tournaments at Greenwich, where the king jousted in gilded armor, and the growing tensions with the Pope over matters of faith. But for now, these were distant shadows. The immediate concern was the tide, which could strand a man if not timed right. Arriving at the north bank near Billingsgate, Thomas disembarked amid the clamor of fishmongers unloading their catches, cod, herring, and eels fresh from the sea. The markets of London were a symphony of chaos, even in the early hours. Cheapside, the city's commercial spine, was already alive with vendors crying their wares. Hot peas cods, fresh mussels, fine needles from Antwerp. The streets were narrow, often no wider than a cart's span, flanked by overhanging buildings that blocked much of the light. Timber-framed facades, some painted in bright hues of red and blue, displayed signs for inns like the Bell or the Swan, where travelers and locals alike sought respite. Thomas made his way to the Wool Exchange near Lombard Street, where merchants from across England and the Low Countries converged. Wool was the backbone of Tudor economy, England's golden fleece, exported to Flanders for weaving into fine cloth, bringing wealth that trickled down even to apprentices like him. He spent the morning expecting bales, negotiating prices with a Flemish trader whose accent was thick as the fog, all while dodging apprentices darting about with messages and dodging the occasional splash from a chamber pot emptied from an upper window with a shouted "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," a warning to beware the water. As midday approached, the city's pulse quickened. Church bells rang for sext, calling workers to a brief pause. Thomas joined a group of fellow apprentices near a cook shop, where pies filled with mutton, onions, and spices were baked in earthenware and sold hot. Eating out was common for those without time to return home, and the aroma of roasting meats mingled with the sharper scents of the street, horse dung, unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of tanneries along the Fleet Ditch. Conversation turned to local news, a recent execution at Tyburn for theft, where crowds gathered to watch the condemned swing from the gallows, the arrival of a ship from the New World bearing exotic spices, and murmurs about the King's court, where favorites like Thomas Wolsey, the ambitious cardinal, wielded influence. Wolsey's rise from butcher's son to Lord Chancellor exemplified the social mobility possible in this era, yet it also bred resentment among the old nobility. For ordinary Londoners, the royal presence was felt in taxes levied for the king's wars and in the pageantry of processions when Henry rode through the streets in a caparisoned stallion, his entourage in silks and velvets contrasting sharply with the homespun wool of the masses. Back at home in Southwark, Agnes managed the household with quiet efficiency. Tudor women, though legally subordinate to their husbands, held significant sway in domestic affairs. She tended the garden, growing cabbages, turnips, and herbs essential for both food and medicine. A neighbor stopped by to borrow a distaff for spinning wool, gossiping about the latest sermon at St. Paul's Cross, where preachers railed against usury and immorality. Religious life permeated everything. The calendar was dotted with saints' days, and monasteries like the one nearby provided alms for the poor while serving as centers of learning. Yet even in these early years, cracks were appearing. Henry's desire for a male heir, his growing frustration with Queen Catherine of Aragon, and the influence of humanist scholars like Thomas More hinted at reforms to come. Ordinary folk sensed the unease. The dissolution of monasteries was still decades away, but debates over indulgences and clerical corruption filtered down to tavern talk. As the afternoon waned, Thomas returned home via the bridge this time, paying the toll to cross its 19 arches. London Bridge was a world unto itself, 138 shops crammed along its length, selling everything from ribbons to books printed on the new presses, inspired by Gutenberg. Houses perched precariously above, some up to 7 stories, their residents enjoying views of the river but enduring the constant rumble of carts and the risk of fire from thatched roofs. Public latrines jutted over the water, their waste dropping directly into the Thames, a practical if unsanitary solution in a city